Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this episode, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Stephen Haynes on his book, The Battle for Bonhoeffer. Now, Dr. Haynes actually has quite a number of other books related to Bonhoeffer, some of which he is going to talk a little bit about in this episode. And he's also got some other interesting ones related to segregation in the church and such. So I definitely recommend you check out all of his other books because he touches on a lot of subjects that I find interesting and which will relate to some of the issues that we have discussed this season. But in this episode, we are particularly focusing on the way that evangelicals are wielding Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or particularly the conservative wing, the Trump wing of evangelicals. And we are going to talk about the issue of truth and why truth matters, and kind of going back to our first episode of the season, why narratives are so important. This is a really short episode, and we don't do justice to how broad and deep the topic is, so I highly recommend that you check out some of Dr. Haynes' other work. All right, Dr. Haynes, thank you so much for being willing to chat today. Before we get started, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your book, The Battle for Bonhoeffer, and what led you to write that.
Hey, Derek. Thanks for the invitation to do this. So my name is Steve Haynes. I teach at Rhodes College in Memphis. I've been here for about 35 years. I've been interested in Bonhoeffer probably since college, but took a more academic interest in him probably in the mid-90s, as I was teaching a course on the Holocaust at Rhodes, and I was interested in the German church struggle and how people like Bonhoeffer had responded to the Nazis. So I wrote 3 books in the 2000s about Bonhoeffer and his reception. And then in 2018, actually in 2016, I wrote an op-ed piece in the Huffington Post shortly after the election, where I tried to sort of sound the alarm about Trump and about the way that people like Eric Metaxas had used Bonhoeffer to sort of rally support for him. And based on that article, I had a couple of offers or pleas to write a book based on that. And so I did so. It took a couple of years to come out. So it came out in 2018. It was called The Battle for Bonhoeffer. And it was an expansion of the essay, but also looking back at how Bonhoeffer had been used and in attempts to understand American culture, American history, American politics, really since 9/11. And so the first 3 chapters deal with that sort of prefatory material, and a lot of the book is about Eric Metaxas and his 2010 book on Bonhoeffer and the way that he had sort of launched this misinformation campaign about the German theologian, and trying to track that in the book.
Yeah, you definitely spend a lot of time focusing on more of the right-wing politics, I think, because of that's the group that's, I think, largely wielding it at this point. But before we kind of zoom in on that, what I really appreciated about your book is that you give a pretty broad view of Bonhoeffer and how he's been used. So I think that would be helpful before we zoom in to kind of talk about that. You said that back in the 60s, when some were identifying that Bonhoeffer was kind of an important figure and starting to put him forward, that he was a Rorschach test, I think is the way that you put it. Could you briefly summarize the kind of bird's eye view of how Bonhoeffer has been used by various groups throughout history?
Yeah, so that was the subject of my 2004 book called The Bonhoeffer Phenomenon. And I divided it up into several different Bonhoeffers, images, portraits of Bonhoeffers that people had developed. One was the radical Bonhoeffer, which sort of saw him as a radical theologian who advocated the death of God, or secularizing theology as it was being conceived in the 1960s. That played out pretty quickly. There's also sort of liberal Bonhoeffer that sees his legacy as particularly related to the view from below and the Christ in the neighbor, and seeing Bonhoeffer as a grandfather of liberation theology. There's an evangelical Bonhoeffer, which I can say more about as we go on. There is a sort of spiritual Bonhoeffer or universal Bonhoeffer, which is Bonhoeffer shorn of all his specific theological commitments. People in this category want to sort of capture his bravery and his humanism without all the religious trappings. And then at the end of the book, I talk about a sort of right-wing Bonhoeffer as it existed at that time in 2004. It was Bonhoeffer being sort of held up as an anti-abortion warrior, somebody who was inspiring those who murdered or sought to murder abortion providers. There was a whole sort of cult of Bonhoeffer in this area. So those are the main pictures that I focused on in that book.
Yeah. Okay, so zooming a little bit into the evangelical circles, which is, I know that I appreciated your kind of testimony of sorts at the end, talking about where you had come from and your association with evangelicalism. And I currently run in those circles as well. And so it's something that my experience resonated very much with your prologue. Being
Yeah.
taught in a Christian school this idea of integrity and all of this stuff my whole life, and then coming to the 20 teens and kind of being shocked at what was happening.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking of my introduction to Bonhoeffer, which was in the 70s. I was in a parachurch Christian group called Young Life. I was in the sort of training cadre, and they asked us to read some books, including The Cost of Discipleship. Of course, they didn't offer any context for understanding it, but it was very provocative, very inspiring. So that was my initial introduction to Bonhoeffer. And so, yeah, to see him sort of co-opted by the political right, and not just the political right, but the Trumpist right, which is about as, in my view, about as far away from Bonhoeffer as it's possible to get, and yet, sort of fashioned Bonhoeffer as a guide for to follow this sort of path. It was really shocking, and I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Yeah, and what was fascinating to me is that so you talk about how Bonhoeffer was a Rorschach test back in the 60s.
Yeah,
But evangelicals, by and large, or that group was not too keen on Bonhoeffer initially. I mean, some of
right,
the theological aspects of questioning the virgin birth and that kind of thing, like that's one of the core fundamentals, from the early
right.
1900s. So and I mean, denominationalism is a huge thing in evangelicalism, where you will separate denominations for very small things that aren't even a part of the fundamentals. So how did
Yeah.
somebody like Bonhoeffer get incorporated to being this huge hero and figurehead for evangelicals, if they have to put aside, or at least bring into question some of these core fundamentals?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The evangelical reception of Bonhoeffer is very interesting. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, there was a strong push against this idea that Bonhoeffer was a suitable Christian hero. And some of the leading Bonhoeffer, some of the leading evangelical scholars at the time, sounded this note of caution that he's not, you may be impressed by his life, and some of his writings may seem very inspiring, but be careful, because he was not a real Christian. We know that because he denied the virgin birth, or was sort of mushy on the resurrection, or because he read and endorsed Bultmann, or because he talks about Hegel, whatever it is. People were very, very reluctant to sort of endorse Bonhoeffer. And this begins to change gradually I think because in evangelical culture, there's this real premium on bravery and standing against the world. And I think as this is my own theory, I think as Christianity becomes saddled with responsibility for a lot of the world's ills, like slavery, the Holocaust, oppression, people are looking for heroes that sort of disprove that narrative. And so Bonhoeffer becomes important because he was somebody who stood up to Hitler, and he was a devout Christian. And he is somebody you can point to if somebody says, well, Christians stood by while Hitler, sort of did his thing. Say, well, what about Bonhoeffer? If people say that about slavery, you say, what about Wilberforce? And by the way, I think this is the formula that Eric Metaxas has used to gain so many book sales and so much success. His two most important books are about Wilberforce and Bonhoeffer. And I think that's not coincidental. He really wants to demonstrate that there are Christians among the good guys, and you don't need to be ashamed if you want to, if you want to use the name of Christ in the 21st century. We have our heroes too.
Yeah, and I noticed that about Wilberforce as well, and I don't know, it seems like it goes very hand in hand with a lot of people in my group not wanting to bear responsibility, wanting to take good things from our history,
Right.
prop up
Absolutely.
the good without taking responsibility for the bad.
Sure.
So, as a Bonhoeffer scholar, it seems like okay, you don't like the way that maybe Bonhoeffer is being wielded by certain groups of people, but it seems like it probably would be it's in your interest that Bonhoeffer's name is doing really well right now, and people are talking about him. No press is bad press type of thing. So why are you so concerned with writing a book that undermines some of the myths about Bonhoeffer, some of the narratives that people have? Um, why do you think truth is so important, and what can we learn from the importance of truth in the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I mean, the first thing you said was as a scholar. So that's partly an answer to your question, right? As a scholar, it's my job to care about truth. And I think it's important to remember that scholarship is an evolutionary process, right? So there's a view of Bonhoeffer that's sort of reigns, and then somebody questions that, and then people critique that, and the sort of thing moves forward. This is natural. And so the Bonhoeffer Society and the Bonhoeffer Guild is a pretty big tent with lots of different views within it. And as long as that tent, is respected, and as long as there's reasonable dialogue going on in there, then I have no problem with that. The problem came when Metaxas came along and said, the tent of Bonhoeffer studies is a lie. It's a lie perpetrated by Bonhoeffer scholars for the last 50 years, and I alone am capable of telling the truth. And the truth is that everything you know about Bonhoeffer is wrong. And subsequently, when those of us within the Bonhoeffer Guild have tried to point out to Metaxas, his errors or engage in him, he's been completely impervious to criticism. And I heard him say just a week or so ago that, the only thing that people had pointed out about his Bonhoeffer book was typos. And he knows better. This is fundamentally dishonest on his part. There are egregious errors of fact in his book. But there's also just this misleading interpretation of Bonhoeffer as essentially an evangelical Christian. So I'm interested in sort of searching for truth in the sort of on the scholarly path that's very slow and evolutionary. But sometimes an intervention needs to be made when somebody has so egregiously, misapplied Bonhoeffer and refused to submit to any criticism or feedback. So I felt like I needed to really address directly the things that had gone wrong in Bonhoeffer interpretation, or things that have gone, far beyond what reasonable people would disagree about. And this seemed like the way to do it.
Yeah, I'm sure that question can kind of sound like a sort of, trite or trivial question, because it's like, well, of course we value truth, but I think the reason that I wanted to ask that and have you expound on truth is because it seems like in our society, in evangelical circles, the ends are justifying the means, and so doing what we need to do in order to accomplish God's will, or the greater good, is something that we're willing to do. And I remember I was having
Yeah,
a conversation, having read your book before watching the Bonhoeffer film. I noticed a couple things that stood out that you had talked about in your book. One of them was that famous quote by Bonhoeffer, which made it into the film. Something to the extent of like, to do nothing is, or to not act is to act.
yeah,
And also his direct involvement with taking Jews to Switzerland
yeah,
was something that was portrayed. And so I'm thinking, as I'm watching the film, I'm like, those are beautiful things. Okay, it's the spirit of Bonhoeffer. I understand what they're trying to say. They're trying to paint this wonderful protagonist that we empathize with, and but at the same time, uh, having those falsehoods in in films like that, or portrayed by people like Metaxas, produce
yeah,
a convenient sort of image that can then be wielded, I think. So
yeah,
I liked your story, and maybe you could, as you're weaving in an answer, kind of weave in some of the stories that you had in your book. But you talk about your experience with one of your pastors, trying to justify, having his means justify the ends with certain political candidates and such. And I think
yeah,
your testimony here is really helpful in understanding the importance
yeah.
of integrity and truth.
Yeah, before I get to that, let me just comment on the quote, right? Not to act is to act, not to speak is to speak. So you mentioned it as a Bonhoeffer quote. It's not a Bonhoeffer quote. And Metaxas is the one who popularized it. Metaxas knows it's not a Bonhoeffer quote. It's been proven demonstrably over and again that it's not a Bonhoeffer quote. And Warren Throckmorton, who's a blogger that I follow, has identified where it came from. So the idea that, again, what scholars do is they present something and somebody comes along and says, I don't think that's a Bonhoeffer person. Okay, my bad. We'll revise it or we'll take it out. This is not what Metaxas does. He just doubles down. And so the movie continues this sort of falsehood. Um, oh yeah. So I grew up in an evangelical church in Key Biscayne, Florida, a suburb of Miami. As it turned out, Richard Nixon had a house on the island. He started coming to church occasionally at our church. He really befriended our pastor, and our pastor got close to him and was invited to the White House to preach and so forth. We were all very proud of that. But I guess, when Watergate unfolded in 73, our pastor, John Huffman, felt very betrayed, and asked Nixon sort of face to face, is any of this true? He was assured that it was not. And when it turned out that he had been lied to, I mean, he publicly reputed Nixon. And by publicly, I mean like in articles in Time Magazine and places like that. And this is something that I respected at the time as a young evangelical, but began to respect more and more as I grew older. The importance of speaking truth to power and not being seduced by power. This is the part that I think evangelicals today have really failed to understand, that they're shifting sort of moral values with regard to political candidates. It's really a reflection of something deeper, which is the ease with which they've been seduced to give their support to someone in exchange for a seat at the table and cultural relevance. I think they feel like their relevance has been eroding, and it's come back, and they want to make sure they take advantage of that. And that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing as Christians. And it's the exact opposite of what I saw as a kid, as a teenager, and so going through this Trump thing, it really reminded me of this, and I got in touch with John Huffman and his family. I read his biography, make sure I had all the details right, and so I retold that story as a way of sort of reminding evangelicals and Christians generally what it is that we could be doing, what it is we should be doing.
Yeah, like I said, that was the part I think that resonated the most with me was your testimony at the end. Because, honestly, when I first saw your book, I didn't read your book when it first came across as a recommended reading for me. Because when I see political sounding sorts of books, a lot of times I think, okay, this is just going to be a polarization of somebody bashing the other side. And while I might agree with one bashing more than another, I didn't want that. But a friend recommended it to me, a friend who I trust, and as I read it, I was really pleasantly surprised with how balanced you were, and especially your humility at the end with tying in your own story and not lambasting people, but calling to repentance and reflection. I thought it was very helpful for me, for my heart. So
Thanks for saying that. I
yeah.
appreciate that feedback.
Yeah. So, final question here for you. So, a
Yeah,
lot has happened um, since the book was first released, and I was kind of surprised when I saw when it was released. It was 7-ish years ago, and
yeah,
Trump has had 2 more years of presidency since you released that book. COVID happened. We had a Democrat president in between, and now Trump has been reelected, and
yeah,
now there's a Bonhoeffer film out. So a
yeah.
ton has happened in the Bonhoeffer world, in the evangelical world, in the political world. If you were just releasing this book now in 2024, almost
Mhm.
2025, what do you think that you would add, remove, or emphasize to fit with where we are today?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I'm in contact with Erdman's about revising the book and updating it. I don't know exactly what that'll look like, but I have been keeping up. I've been doing papers since 2018 at Bonhoeffer meetings about what's happened in the previous year or 2 years and so forth. And so I hope I can expand the book and update it. I mean, the basic story is the same. It's right, the co-opting of Christians to support uh, fundamentally anti-Christian movement, in my view. Um, this stuff around January 6th is really the thing that's so interesting. We have somebody like Metaxas who, up till then, I think had convinced people that he was this winsome evangelical in the mold of Chuck Colson. He just goes full Trump and just into lunacy and has been there ever since. And you'd think that that would give people pause, right, about his interpretation of Bonhoeffer and his claim that Bonhoeffer would be in his camp. Maybe it has for some, and maybe he's finally his star is descending. I don't know, but it's just such a cautionary tale of how somebody can can relinquish whatever credibility they might have had to that point um, by just buying into this lie and to this cult and losing any sort of credibility he had, and now being there's threat of him being sued by the Bonhoeffer family. He was involved. I think it's an ongoing uh, uh, litigation by Dominion Voting Systems where he was called out for his claims about the way that the election had been hacked and so forth. So I hope I can sort of update it. It's not fun material to talk about, but it's really important, I think, and to see the trajectory that he's been on.
Well, um, I'm really encouraged by books like yours that I think there are a lot of people like me who are really dissatisfied with where our evangelical group is at the moment. And it's really hard when you feel like you're the only one who kind of sees those sorts of things. So to have truth being told, and to have it be told in such a humble way and a loving way is really helpful. So thank you so much for your work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek, for inviting me to be on your podcast. Appreciate it.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.